John, Rupa.
Thanks. Yeah, and thank you both for coming in. And Charles, super moving to hear behind the lies down lie statistics, deflection, in denial stuff of last week with Human Story. Our hearts go out to you, my heart as a mother. I don't think you're supposed to say that anymore, but look, we all, yeah, thank you for everything you're doing. Did you say that in the Luke Ashton case it was recorded on a death certificate for the first time?
Yes, for the first time under the medical cause of death. The coroner put gambling disorder, and he did that within his narrative. He said, I did write it down somewhere, if I can perhaps just quote him. He said, and this kind of shows the lack of understanding of so many people who are not involved in gambling about the risk. He said, I was also at the outset of my case management of Luke's case of the view that there must, his emphasis, have been some other or further reason for Luke having a mental health disorder. The evidence that he heard, both from the medical side of things, but also an analysis of Luke's betting, he was convinced, despite his starting point of thinking there must be something else. And if I can just say, one of the most difficult things about hearing the Betting and Gaming Council last week or whenever it was hearing their CEO talking about suicide. And his statement was something along the lines of, when he first took the job, he spoke to the Samaritans about suicide. And he heard back from them that suicide is complex. That is such a misrepresentation of the Samaritans and indeed the other mental health charities about suicide. They, for the best reasons, use that portrayal of complexity so that we all take responsibility for suicides, rather than thinking that's a mental health issue, we can push it over there, those people will deal with that. To see that statement done for the best of intentions to say effectively this isn't gambling, it is something else, is just wrong. And if I can quote Professor Sir Lewis Appleby, who is the chair of the National Suicide Prevention Advisory Group, he runs the National Inquiry into suicide. He's possibly the leading suicide researcher in the UK. He said, in terms of this use by the industry, is yes, it is a cynical misrepresentation. Suicide is complex, but sometimes, and gambling is an example, there is a dominant factor without which a suicide would not have happened. Now, we are going to be working with the Samaritans to get them to have a more nuanced statement so that they cannot be misrepresented. But so the misrepresentation that I heard last week was, it was an insult to every family, everybody who's actually been harmed by gambling. But more importantly, it is wrong. And until the industry actually accepts the danger, the addictiveness and the harms done by their products, then nothing is going to change. And that's kind of what I mean by culture change. They have to look at themselves, they have to look at the harms and accept it rather than obfuscate.
Do you think part of the whole "it's not me, Gov" attitude of the industry, do you think we've got a problem with the word problem gambling, with that term itself, because that implies it's the individual, whereas actually it's a whole complex set of things, industry, state, policy, products, all these things, whereas it seems to be, it's a personality flaw of that individual that they're saying.
That's absolutely the basis of all the industry's defence, is this is an individual problem, and the term problem gambler cites the problem within the individual and detracts from the idea that there's any problem in the products and practices of the industry. The language and the framing of this is fundamental, and that's what's polluted the terms of reference of the white paper. It's this constant push of individual responsibility, and we see it borrowed from tobacco. There used to be a concept of responsible smoking, believe it or not. Individual responsibility is used by the tobacco industry, it's used by the fossil fuel industry to great effect. to detract from their practices, and gambling have really picked it up and run with it. The danger with gambling is that you take something which has already got a very high suicide risk, all right? And the neuroscientists will tell you about the synapses in the brain and the danger of the actual repetitive gambling products which create that suicide risk. You then heap on top of that the stigma that comes from the individual responsibility gambling narrative, right? So this idea that it's your fault, that you must be weak, you're the vulnerable individual, it's your fault, not ours. And you increase what was already a high suicide risk to something which is now, accounting for almost 10% of suicides in the UK.
Yeah, this white paper proposes the statutory levy that's going to fund, we talked quite a lot about research in the previous panel, but also education and treatment. Education, there doesn't seem to be a lot said about education. Is this an oversight?
It's not necessarily an oversight. So education, so there are 100,000 children in the UK who are either already addicted to gambling or at risk. That's one child in every secondary school classroom. This is a very serious issue for young people, right? This is a growing issue. So education clearly has a role. But in the face of £1.5 billion of advertising telling you it's fun and safe and sexy, it's going to be very difficult in one session a year to combat that onslaught, that bombardment of advertising that young people are facing. There is still a role for it. The education that's on the market at the moment was analysed by some esteemed public health academics at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and at Cambridge University, May Van Chalkwyk and Mark Pettigrew. And they analysed the education delivered by the three main providers. That's Gamble Aware, YGAM and GamCare, two of those organisations you had giving evidence last week. And their analysis found that the education materials on the market problematise children, distract from the role of industry products and practices, and serve to normalise gambling. So the industry-funded education on the market now is actually, in a way, promoting gambling, right, and is defending the industry's prospects. It's a really awful situation that we're in, and again, we then so welcome the statutory levy. This need for independent funding should clean up the education system and reduce that risk and start to give young people real evidence of the differentiated product risk. What young people need to know is that not all gambling is alike. What are the most dangerous activities? What are the most dangerous practices of the industry, so they can make an informed decision about what to do.
Should it be left to charities, or should it be a national curriculum thing about financial budgeting and response? And should it be at every stage?
We would love to see it as a national curriculum thing. I think that's a stretch. The national curriculum is under pressure, obviously. If it is left to charities, I think there need to be very strict guidelines as to what needs to be included. Actually, Charity Commission guidelines are quite strict about the delivery of education, and I'm not sure the industry-funded charities are actually abiding by their Charity Commission expectations. When you're educating about something which is a legitimate charitable activity, if there are differing views as to the source of the problem in this case, you need to make sure that you are representing both those views. The industry-funded education simply gives the individual responsibility narrative, the industry framing of this issue.
I think it extends to public information in terms of thinking about public health campaigns around gambling. We'll remember from years gone by about cigarettes, drink driving.
The squirrel.
So it really is an issue that side of things needs to be taken out of the hands of industry and industry-funded organisations. I think that the more recent Gamble Aware campaigns have been improvements on what they have done in the past. The Take Time to Think, Bet Regret campaigns, but the focus is still very much on the individual responsibility and the individual talking to somebody. Now, of course, absolutely, that has to be the case, but there is nothing about products. There is absolutely nothing that would inform a member of the public that the National Lottery is a completely different product in terms of its risk, etc., to a high-speed online electronic game. There has to be much better public health messaging. Should
there be a more defined role in planning policy to stop the clustering of these physical shops. I think you said Jack started off in those, the
Yeah,
fruit machine.
very much so. So the cumulative impact assessments, I think, are very welcome, and we've been involved with people in Sheffield who have opposed the opening of new gambling venues in the city, but it's difficult, and so I do think that is really important. There's lots of statistics, obviously, about the clustering of betting outlets, particularly in more deprived areas. That local people, local authorities have got to have much more control over that.
Let's hope there's some progress, because I think damp and mould and air quality have been on death certificates in the last year, and people are saying it's got to be different. So,
well, I mean, gambling disorder being there as a medical cause of death is massive. It's the first.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rupa.